We'll sort of go through a short presentation and then we'll hand it over to Rich.
Excellent. So welcome everybody. As Lisa mentioned, I'm just going to mute everybody. So I apologize for that. You'll hear a "you have been muted."
Conference muted.
Excellent. So the Vegetation Management Task Force. Vegetation Management Task Force is a part of CIADI International. We do have quite a few guests on the call, so those of you who are part of the Vegetation Management Task Force, please bear with me as I go through the presentation. So what is CIADI? What CIADI International does is it facilitates networking for utilities from around the world. We have participants spread out from Japan over to Europe, over to South America, and we're constantly increasing our participation. And it's a good way to share information, share best practices among people that are doing similar jobs to yours in different environments in different areas in the world. CIADI International also facilitates the development of highly leveraged, collaborative, and innovative projects for utilities. So when participants propose projects that they would have to pay thousands and thousands of dollars for, they can share that among other utilities and have those projects run through CIADI and pay much less for that. We also organize conferences, conference calls, meetings, and webinars such as the one you will be experiencing today or witnessing today. So this is a participation map of our participants. As you can see, we are around the world, and we're slowly creeping into more and more into Europe and Australia and Africa as well. CIADI currently operates 18 independent programs. Some of them are smaller, some of them are larger and more developed. They spread across generation, transmission, cross-utility, distribution, and utilization. And so we are right here under the cross-utility, which means that the Vegetation Management Task Force does not only cover distribution, but it also covers topics from transmission, generation, and distribution. So now over to you, Gwen.
The Vegetation Management Task Force, the purpose is to bring industry professionals together to discuss and develop solutions on common industry issues, create network opportunities in the management of vegetation. And as Alex already mentioned, it also serves as a forum to identify knowledge gaps and to provide future research and study to address these gaps. We got the next slide?
We've got it.
So the vegetation group was initiated in November 2013, and we now have 15 members, and you can see the members on the screen here.
So our very own technical advisor, Gwen Shrimpton, who is speaking, she's a registered professional forester, biologist, and has a master's degree in pest management. She has been with us for the last year and helped us develop the program along with Bob Mann, who is on the next slide. And we're very happy to have Gwen with us as she has been very, very important in the development of the topics and the drive of this group. This is our other technical advisor, Bob Mann. He has worked for Manitoba Hydro for 32 years, and more than 32 years, the last 20 of which he was responsible for the development, implementation, and administration of the distribution systems integrated vegetation management programs. Bob Mann has also been with us for the last year, and he's also been an integral part in the development of the group. So these are our technical advisors. And then back to you, Gwen.
So it's important to note that the main focus areas of this group were developed by the participants. So this is a really user-driven group, and by polling the members, we came up with these focus areas. These are the top 5 are basically number 1 is how to make the best use of available funding. Everyone's always trying to get the money they need for the programs. The second one is how to improve reliability and reduce trees cause outages. Number 3 is environmental issues such as migratory birds, species at risk, or riparian areas. Number 4 is how to justify your budget to your managers and how to identify risks from delaying or canceling the work. So basically, we've got how to make the best use of the funding you've got, and the fourth one is how to try and get the funding that you need. The fifth one is vegetation inventories and patrols. So methods, tools, and systems used to collect and store data. And number 6 is urban vegetation management, basically dealing with public and municipal and property owner concerns over vegetation management programs. Then continuing with the focus areas, these next set were ones that were deemed as not as important as the first ones. So number 7 is applications and methods such as LIDAR, looking at the whole new technology in this area. Number 8 is adaptation strategies for changing forest and tree health, and this is basically to do with climate change and the fact that forests are not as healthy and we've got more dead, dying, and leaning trees to deal with. Number 9 is regulatory requirements, so things such as NERC or federal, provincial, or municipal or state regulations. Number 10 is all around herbicides, decision-making guidelines on when to use herbicides and cost-benefit, basically justifying their use. And finally, we have responsible vegetation management practices, new materials, and techniques.
Thank you, Gwen. So going on to our vegetation management annual activities, we have a 2-day conference with our participants receiving the 2 complimentary passes. We have an annual meeting following the conference, and this is a closed-door, utility-only meeting where people can speak freely about their issues and problems, and we sometimes have outside presenters come in as well. We usually hold 4 to 5 conference calls annually and hold 4 to 6 training webinars, and our participants receive unlimited participation in these webinars, so they can send the link out to whoever would be interested. You can join freely. We also have surveys and information exchanges, so when our participants are interested in hearing feedback from other group members, they can submit a question or 2 questions, and I'll send that out to the group and get some feedback for them shortly thereafter. And our surveys are developed by the technical advisors on topics that are brought up during meetings or conference calls. And they're also in the process of trying to develop 2 projects that, there were 3 projects actually, that have been sent out to the group recently.
So I'll briefly go over the projects that we have that we're looking at for this year. The first one is vegetation management cost comparisons for different practices. So this is the objective of the project is to establish relative cost and resource requirements for various treatment and control options for defined vegetation management communities. The second one is basically to produce a video that would be generic enough that it could be used by utilities throughout North America, and the purpose would be to explain to the general public the need to prune and trim trees, particularly in urban areas. And the third project is it's about control of weeds in electrical facilities such as substations, and it would be to taking the products that are available in both the United States and Canada to develop a model herbicide program to control weeds that would utilize the products that are available and use them in a manner that would reduce the development of resistance in weed populations, and also to add to that strategies to reduce reliance on herbicides such as preventative measures and any recommendations for non-herbicide techniques. And then we have 2 surveys that are these first 2, we have draft surveys ready to go. First one is all about widening or recovering right-of-ways, how utilities have managed to put the business case together, did they manage to get capital or OMA funding, so all about how to get that project up and running. And the second one is the mapping platforms. So what sort of electronic or paper systems do people have to collect the data that they need for the inventories, and also the methods that they're using to store the data. And the surveys that we have planned yet for this year is cost-benefit of hazard tree programs, LIDAR effectiveness and use, and any things that people have on written line clearance and work specifications. So these are all surveys.
Thank you, Gwen. So our upcoming conference will be in December 2nd and 3rd. We are still finalizing the location, but it will be in Florida in the USA. And the meeting will be on the 4th of December. And the themes for this year's conference are public and social issues, techniques and products, program management, and environmental issues. So I would like to invite everybody to this conference. It's going to be great. So we had 6 2014 webinars on very interesting topics from great presenters. Most of these should be recorded and posted up on the MyCID portal for all participants' use and future reference. Oh, and I would like to introduce our presenter for today, Richard Johnstone from IVM Partners. Rick Johnstone has 38 years of experience in utility vegetation management, having served as system forester for 2 electric utilities and as president of the 501c3 nonprofit corporation IVM Partners. Conducts IVM research and presents findings at conferences and workshops for federal, state, and tribal land management agencies, along with electric and natural gas utilities, conservationists, and academia. He provides consultation to utilities, agencies, and land managers under VMES, LLC, and is a past president of the Utility Arborists Association and a registered professional forester with a bachelor degree in forest resources management from West Virginia University. So thank you, Richard, for accepting our invitation today to present. We're looking forward to your presentation. And if somebody does not have a copy of the presentation, you can feel free to send us a chat message, and we will get that sent over to you. If you are unable to connect to the video to see the slides, I can send over the PowerPoint slides over to you in PDF format. So you can send me an email and let us know. So I guess over to you, Rick.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, and we can see your screen as well.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And I know we have the question and answer bar on the right, so if you have questions, you can type them in. I'm going to save trying to answer anything to the end, because oftentimes as I go through, the questions you might have early will be answered as the presentation continues. So let me go right into it. My background from right now doing some advice to the White House, the U.S. EPA, and USDA and Fish and Wildlife Service on the federal strategy on pollinators. This was a proclamation that Obama signed last June 20th, basically instructing the agencies to come up with a strategy on how they can improve pollinator habitat. I'll go into some more detail as we go along. And I've been an advisor for some different things, the right-of-way stewardship accreditation, with Steve Slisovitz on the U.S.-Canadian Blackout Report. And as was mentioned, I've worked for a couple utilities. That was in my bio. IVM Partners I formed about 12 years ago, basically because there was no entity that was acting as a liaison between the public agencies and the utilities. I was part of a team with Edison Electric Institute trying to develop a memorandum of understanding with the federal agencies. And we weren't getting very far, which is not unusual to not get things accomplished in Washington, D.C., but I talked talked to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation about the need for some entity, and they said that they liked the idea, but it would need to be nonprofit. So that's when I formed IVM Partners. And our board of directors, as you can see, is across from electric and gas utilities, from consulting, both in Canada and the U.S., industry associations, and universities. Well, what do we mean by IVM? It's basically a system of managing the plant community to be compatible with the objective of what you're trying to manage for. And then the control methods are what are the processes that you use to establish that. And you want to look at not only the primary objective, but secondary. So when you look at the electric utilities, gas utilities, and also the highway departments, you've got safety, you have access, site distance, reliability of services. And then the secondary objectives are the things that need to be taken into consideration by the utilities and the highways that are important aspects of our culture. So the control methods are basically the tools in the toolbox. You can go from manual to mechanical to herbicides, but you really want to end up getting to the biological and cultural controls. So the best practice is to use the right tool at the right time to try to achieve your objective at the least cost, both economics and the environment. This is not a new process. This research goes back over 60 years. Dr. Bramble and Dr. Burns over in Pennsylvania started researching because deer hunters thought that herbicides were killing the deer. And so when they started doing the different documentation, they said, no, you can actually improve wildlife habitat. And they expanded from deer to birds to butterflies, salamanders. There's a lot of research available. And about 20 years ago, they came up with a wire zone, border zone concept of the fact that particularly the electric industry needs low-growing vegetation where those conductors are so that they don't have things growing up that can cause an outage. And then outside of that, you could allow some shrubs or small stature trees into that, what's called the border zone. And I use that concept where I worked for 25 years, which is the Delmarva Peninsula, which stands for Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. It's the eastern shore, which is all along the 200-mile Chesapeake Bay. And I didn't necessarily do the entire conductor zone. I wanted to make sure we had access for our line trucks to get to the towers and poles to do their maintenance. And then we allowed shrubs as long as things were not getting too tall. The benefit was widespread. A lot of different animals benefited from this type of plant community. And I would get different groups, say Quail Unlimited, wanting us to plant something for quail. And I say, well, you'll get what you need for quail, but we don't have to plant. We just need to manage and allow the natural regeneration to come back. So songbird habitat comes in, especially with the shrubs and feeding on the insects. Mammals bed and feed in these right-of-ways. The raptors are always patrolling it because their food is in there. And then as you manage, you take advantage of the biological and cultural controls. On the far left corner on the top is a right-of-way that was mowed. But as you manage, you allow low-growing vegetation to take over. Plants are competing for water, for sunlight, for nutrients. And a lot of plants produce their own herbicides to fight for that niche, which is one of the problems you run into with invasive plants. A lot of them produce allelopathic chemicals. What we're wanting to do is take the natural management and use that to our advantage. Instead of fighting nature, working with it. And then the birds and field mice and voles that come and use these right-of-ways are going to help keep that under control. One of the studies Dr. Bramble and Burns did was they planted red maple seeds and they put cages on half of the seeds. Practically the only ones that germinated were the ones with cages because the animals were so adept at consuming those seeds that fall into the right-of-way from the adjoining woods that it keeps that right-of-way maintained. It also is going to save money. Now this is the actual budget simply taking what was spent in 1980 and applying inflation to it. What was done in 1980 was mowing all the right-of-ways on a 3-year cycle. And you see that the IVM exceeds that cost in a short period there in the mid-'80s. A couple reasons for that. One, in the U.S., it was at the end of the President Carter's administration, interest rates were about 15%. So nobody was borrowing money. We had to cut budgets and get money internally. But you're also going to run into its more intense management. Instead of mowing and waiting 3 years or 5 years, depending on what kind of growing season you have, you're going to mow it, and then after one growing season, you're going to do a herbicide treatment, and then you're going to touch it up within 2 years. So to get it under control, you go through that period. But you see, after 1990, we never had to mow anything, and it's continued to drop until inflation took over. So we went from 13 mowing crews to 3 herbicide application crews during that period. So just kind of like a bullet points of what IVM is. You have to define what are your objectives. When do you need to do something? Inspect the site ahead of time. Evaluate it. Communicate what you're going to do internally and externally. Choose and implement the best method, and then do quality assurance. Did you get what you look for? What needs to change? And then it starts over. It's a cyclic process. Now, what got me interested in documentation is some of the things that were occurring in Maryland when we were starting our work. This is what I call the maple swamp. There was nothing but red maples. And we did one broadcast treatment and then touched it up on the ground and got it back to a wetland meadow. But we started seeing orchids germinating. And so I went to the heritage program of the state of Maryland. I said, where are these coming from? There was nothing here but red maple. And they said, well, we're finding out these plants can lie dormant up to 150 years. And it was usually fire that released them because the Native Americans on the Chesapeake region, they would set the woods on fire almost every year to drive game for hunting to get enough food for the winter. And so the understory would burn, and it opened these sites up. And so a lot of the plants that we end up having on a threatened and endangered list, I always say to the agencies, the ecosystems they need to grow in are what's rare. We get the ecosystems managed, we'll get the plants back. Now, I started in the electric industry, but as a consultant, I got into with natural gas, and there's differences, but not as extreme differences. All of them, we need to take advantage of the technology. We can map out what's out there. We can pinpoint where we need to do work. We can take into account regulations such as pollution discharge regulations of knowing where the water is and what type of techniques we need to do depending on where we come to. So in my consulting side of it, or even with the nonprofit, we'll come up with herbicide mixes that meet the habitats and the plants we're trying to control. There's also returnable, refillable containers available. You can have pre-mix according to the rates you want to use. That's delivered to the contractor. They use it. The empties are picked up, and they're reused. You can also use the technology to keep track of everything that's done. So you know what was used, when, where, how many square feet or meters, and what the weather conditions were. Now, what's been going on in the industries is that both gas and electric, a lot of them had not maintained their right-of-ways properly. This is a pipeline that's actually going through the forest because they always mowed, and the guys on the mowers don't like to get hit in the head with branches, so they'd always move over a little bit. You do that for 20, 30 years, pretty soon you're mowing, but the pipe is over in the trees because you basically have slid the right-of-way over. So the utilities have been reclaiming their right-of-ways to get them back into a manageable state. And mowing is a tool you need to use to get this under control, but you can't manage with just cutters. And there's problems with them. You can have erosion when you take everything off and you get a heavy rain. If you don't have a good riparian buffer, that sediment is going to come down with the rain, wash into trout and salmon streams, affecting the fish and the wildlife that's using that water. Mowers leave a lot of ruts if they're mowing in wetlands. This is what Delmarva looked like in their wetlands when we took over from the mowing. And people will say, we don't want to use any chemicals, that's why we don't want herbicides. Well, if you go behind a mowing operation, you're going to find hydraulic fluid, oil, gas that has leaked from that housing. Those mowers are being jostled back and forth on those right-of-ways. They are inherently leaking. So you are getting chemicals, you just don't see them. Same thing with a chainsaw. Every time you add oil or gas to a chainsaw, you add bar chain oil. That oil is being spit on the ground as you're cutting. So if you cut an area of dense vegetation, you can put about a gallon of oil on every acre, which can contaminate 1 million gallons of water. So again, environmentally, it's not the best thing. We always hear talk about, all right, greenhouse gases, climate change, but people ignore the fact that these mowers are spewing out hydrocarbons as they're mowing. So do we continue to do these repetitive maintenance operations? And then a right-of-way that is mowed opens it up for off-road vehicles. This upsets landowners, and I know a lot of the national forests in the U.S. are trying to stop this. Wildlife has a hard time getting out of the way of 3,000 RPM blades, especially turtles and eggs that can't move. And even fawns that can, they instinctively lie low when danger approaches. So if you have a dense vegetation, the mower operator may not see that deer until it's too late. But what have you done to the plants? You took the top off, and what you ended up doing is encouraging that plant to do coppice sprouts. You end up with a lot more branches than you started with, which in one growing season can block your access back into that right-of-way. So here's your root system cut off, and if you have something like an oak or a maple, you're going to get 10 or 15 sprouts coming off that mother stem. But if you have a plant that's a root-suckering plant, such as cottonwood or a lantus or black locust, wherever those roots come near the surface, they're going to send a sprout. So you cut one tree, and next year you have 100 of them. And so you end up compounding your problem. And if they are invasive, and you get to these stream areas, that's a good vector for spreading them downstream. And this is one of the situations you run into where people or agencies will say, okay, you can use herbicides, but don't do any herbicide treatments within 50 feet, 100 feet, whatever arbitrary number they come up with from a stream or a wetland. Well, then you're restricted to doing cutting and spreading these plants. And they're very good at producing a lot of seed to spread across other areas. Then you have the workers that have to do this work. Very hazardous to most steep terrain. When it gets too steep, you're using hand saws, which you see here on a mountain. And if you're trying to cut with rocks, snow, and ice, it's a pretty hazardous operation. The other aspect is people will cut and they'll say, all right, we're on a 3-year cycle. Well, how old is that root system? You keep cutting the top off, but it keeps coming back. Now, this is on an actual gas pipeline, and you're looking at stumps of a tree that was probably 20, 30 years old, and it continues to sprout every time it's cut. Well, the roots of the trees are attracted to these pipelines because of these issues. You got moisture, you got warmer soil, you don't have as much compaction. And if you fly over agricultural field in the spring, you'll see the pipe routes where the grasses or the crops are starting to grow better where they have that more moisture. So if you get underground and you look at these pipes, that integrity of the pipe could be affected by those roots that are being allowed to grow near it. This is an actual situation that happened on a gas pipeline in Arkansas where a pine tree was growing too close to the pipe and lightning struck the pine tree, set the woods on fire, and the fire department came out and put out the fire, and then fire shot out of the ground and they realized that there was a gas pipeline underneath. That's a very dangerous situation. So that, you're looking at the pipe that was cut out and the whole board in from the lightning. So the part of the federal strategy on pollinators, it touches on utilities and transportation. So this is taken from there where the Department of Transportation is supposed to look at implementing practices that will improve pollinator habitat and make sure that other agencies or other groups that use their right-of-ways do the same. The natural gas pipelines run under regulations from the Department of Transportation. But if you look at mowing, this is on roadsides. They need to do some mowing for sight distance, but you get, again, when you're on major highways, you need to go back so far, the hazardous operation to keep doing it. But the issue that I see out there is you don't need to mow 300 feet or 100 meters away from the roadside. You need to mow a certain distance, maybe 60 feet. And then that backside, you could allow that to grow and do selective management to bring back pollinator habitat along the roadside. Now, I did consultation with the Department of Transportation in Delaware, and this is the thing that we were showing. They were talking about having to go out and landscape. And I said, you don't need to plant. Stop doing so much mowing and then be selective. Take out the invasives, take out the taller species you don't want, and allow the native wildflowers and grasses to come in. Because mowing is not management, right? You're controlling the growth by constantly cutting it back. Same thing as mowing your grass. You're going to mow it this week, you're going to mow it next week. Management is you're going to change the type of vegetation to be compatible with the service you're providing. So when you take these areas that had been mowed all the time, now you can come in and do selective treatment and get it back to vegetation that might be more beneficial to pollinators. The same thing in the cities. A lot of the cities require the utilities to mow grass for grass height ordinances, so it can't exceed 10 or 12 inches tall. Well, I'm working with Baltimore Gas and Electric in the inner city, where it's a minority district. There's not areas for the kids to go. They don't have a park right there. We stop mowing, and you're looking at one growing season, not even an entire growing season, and you have all your grasses and you see milkweed coming in. Now the kids in the school, they could come out and have field tours. They have butterflies, birds, things that they could look at, that these right-of-ways going through towns could actually be park-like areas rather than mowed like somebody's front yard. And you can actually improve public relations. On the left is a picture of a right-of-way going through the Delmarva Peninsula, and this is a distribution line. A lot of utilities think we're only talking about transmission. You can do it on narrow right-of-ways. When we started converting, there's a gardening show on the radio, and people were calling up and thanking us for planting wildflowers. So I called up the talk show, and I said, I'm the forester. I said, but we're not planting wildflowers. And she said, well, what are you doing? It looks so beautiful. I said, we're spraying herbicides. Well, if you've ever been on the radio, there's a 10-second delay. And it went the whole 10 seconds. But she said, well, can you come on the program and explain it, which I did. But I also told them we're only keeping out tall-growing trees, so it'll end up going to the scrub stage, which you see on the right. And you're not going to have as many wildflowers, you'll have more shrubs. But we have the ability to manipulate the plant community in that fashion. So you can improve safety, aesthetics, and provide habitat for birds and pollinators with an IVM program. And you can meet all these other issues, homeland security, wildlife, ecosystem management, the site distance, stewardship, invasive species control, and wildfire control. I'm going to go through a few partnerships. This is in the state of Michigan, and this is a transmission line going through a park. When I approached the contractor, I said, well, why did you top all the trees? You're on transmission. You can't have trees under the conductors. They said, well, we never cut down trees in a park. And I said, well, did you talk to the park superintendent? They said, no. Well, I talked to the superintendent and explained to him what was possible. We took a walk on the right-of-way, and he said, yeah, let's change it. Well, this is what the upland areas look like. Again, the trees were being topped. We cleared the trees, and on the right, we're doing herbicide application with an 18 TV. And you see how the plants went from the trees on the left to herbaceous plants, wildflowers, and grasses on the right within 2 years. And we started seeing Blanding's turtle, which is a rare turtle, coming into this wet meadow area. Invasives such as spotted knapweed, which is that pinkish flower on the right, we used herbicides that would take out Canada thistle and knapweed, and so you see the right-of-way on the left is completely clear. And they ended up getting quail back because the oak savanna prairie was coming back, the habitat that the quail needed. In the wetland area, again, they were topping trees. These happen to be mostly Norway maple, which is invasive, and it's supplanting the native sugar maple. So the park was more than happy to have them removed. We didn't cut everything down. We did some either girdling or what's called hack and squirt, where we make an axe cut, spray herbicide into the cut. And so we would delimb the trees, drop some for salamanders and snakes, and you see the herbaceous plants coming up around the log, and then leave some of these wildlife den trees that are not going to impact the transmission line anymore, but to provide habitat for things like Indiana bat, raccoons, squirrels, whatever. We had another study in one of the metro parks where they have a lot of buckthorn and autumn olive, and here you see basically 2 months after the mowing operation, most of that is buckthorn. So our botanist is documenting the plant community. So we did a broadcast treatment because it's almost all buckthorn. And then we split the right-of-way in half. Half of it we treated, half of it we left as a control. That's 2 years later. The botanist is in the background on the treated side, and that's 2 years later on the control side. His white hat is on the left side of that screen. He's about 6 feet tall. So you're looking at 2 years of growth. When you plot out what comes in, the mowing side in 07 and 08 is maybe 15% desirable plants, so 85% are undesirable. Whereas the treated side, 90% are the plants you want, a mixture of grasses and forbs. Add 2 more years to it, and you're looking at an IVM site on the left and mowing on the right, which means they have to cut it now or they're going to have an outage, threat of an outage on that transmission line. I'm going to switch over to gas. This is the state of Tennessee, outside of Nashville, Tennessee. And the gas company called me and they said the Army Corps of Engineers won't let us use herbicides. Well, it's an island, about 5 acres crossing an island. And I met with the Army Corps and I went over IVM and they said, well, we like this idea. And I said, well, what did the gas company want to do? They said, well, they wanted to use the herbicide picloram, or Tordon, and they wanted to apply it by helicopter. And I said, well, I would have told them no. I mean, if you spray with a helicopter, the brush is 15, 20 feet tall on that picture on the left. You don't get much snow and ice in Nashville. This stuff is going to stand a while. It's a recreational lake. A lot of people are boating and camping and swimming. You'd get a lot of complaints. And the herbicide picloram is not registered for water, and it should not be used where there's limestone soils because you have sinkholes. And it is a herbicide that is active in the soil that would affect the root systems downstream or off target. I said, but we have herbicides that are registered for this. So they gave us the okay. This is what it looked like before we started. So we brought a bush hog out by pontoon boat. Then we followed up the following year after one growing season, broadcast herbicide treat. That's the response. And then I needed to do a selective treatment, and the company Progressive Solutions donated the crew, and I bought the herbicides. We followed up with backpacks. So on the left, you see a crew treating, and on the right is my botanist, Robin Hagee, the next year, documenting the plant community. And that's the same shot where it showed it so overgrown. This is what it looked like in 2 years. So we have a grass buffer along the water side where we just took out the trees. We've ended up releasing the state flower of Tennessee, passion flower, Virginia wild oats, good for quail and turkey. And then we came back and treated in 2012, and you see all the milkweed coming in by the gas pylon. The other thing about when you're actually managing and an agency knows that you're doing what you said you would do, you have the credibility, they are not going to fight it. Everybody complains about the Army Corps of Engineers taking a long time to get permits. When we wanted to retreat in 2012, I sent the Army Corps of Engineers an email and I said, this is what we would like to do. Here's the herbicides we want to use. I got a letter of permission the next day. So you need to make sure that you have the credibility, because this is the type of thing they want on that gas pipeline. It's not affecting the access for the pipeline. They can do their work, but again, you've got things like milkweed that are coming in for pollinators. Then we followed up with a workshop with the Army Corps, with the gas company, and Tennessee Valley Authority, which is the electric company that runs their power system out of those hydroelectric dams. Now, the person who's doing demonstration, he's 85 years old. He's been in this business since 1948, Roy Johnstone. And he's demonstrating an application with what acts as a surfactant, a carrier called Finvert, and it stands for a thin inversion. And what it does is it'll stick to the leaves and spread out, and so you get much better effect. This is something I really recommend out west where we have the desert climates, because if you spray with just water and you have 15% humidity and it's 95 degrees, the water is going to evaporate almost immediately. The plant can't absorb the herbicide as a salt. It needs to be in a liquid form. So with this, you get it holding the moisture, stays moist for probably a half an hour. The other benefit of it is all the droplets are the same size. You don't get any drift. There's no wind drift. If a gust of wind hits, the entire pattern will move over, but not break up into small micro droplets that will then scatter. When I did a presentation for one of the Gas Association conferences, a lady from FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in the U.S. that has jurisdiction over gas, she gave me this line. She said if pipelines would stop routine mowing, spreading the invasive plants, it would resolve 95% of the complaints we get. So this is that same right away a year after treatment. You can see it's just the plants that were treated that are brown. We asked the gas company to allow us to take, this is on the mainland, not the island. Instead of mowing it, they were mowing those right-of-ways every year. I said, don't mow it this year, let us do a selective treatment. When you're mowing all the time, what you see in 2012, you've got almost 70% of the plant community are grasses because you continue to take out that root system. In one growing season, you see that the grasses are around 30%, and instead you got about 50% coming in your forbs, your flowering plants. So you can bring back the pollinator habitat basically in one growing season if you stop mowing. And then the other treatment we tried is where we're treating just the pipe zone, just where the pipe is. If they need that lower vegetation to take out any woody plants and only have grasses where the pipe is, to produce a pipe zone border zone. So for gas, if they need to get in and do an inspection or a cathodic test on that pipe, they don't want things that are too tall. If they need to mow, then just mow a path. Don't mow the entire right-of-way. Now, working with the agencies, the other aspect of the federal strategy is agencies such as the U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, are supposed to look at their permits for power lines and gas pipeline right-of-ways and make any necessary changes to enhance pollinator habitat using IVM and supplementing existing agreements or make memorandums of understanding. What I'm working with the agencies and meeting with them is to say, look, if you have an existing environmental assessment to use herbicides in that forest, whether it's on another utility or another purpose, let's make an amendment to it to allow the same operation to be done on the utility lines rather than reinventing the wheel. Because what happens is a lot of utilities simply will not put that expense out to even start an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement, depending on where it is. And for the forest, this is one in the mountains in Arkansas, the Ouachita Mountains. On the left-hand side is the right-of-way was being mowed, and on the right-hand side is one growing season later. Some of those maple trees are 8 feet tall in 1 year. So what you get from mowing is very short-lived. So we have case studies established to show on a treated site and a control site what is happening out there, and I'm encouraging the other agencies to do some studies on pollinators, especially the bees and butterflies. Kind of what we're doing in Maryland. This is a studies we've been doing, New Jersey Institute of Technology, U.S. Geological Survey, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Rutgers University. And they've done some studies in different parts of the country, but what they stated on, this is one of their slides, all the cool bee sites are IVM sites. And what they're looking at, comparing where some land has been taken out and they try to replant to get it back to the native prairie habitat. If they're using a right-of-way, they're seeing better results on our right-of-way. So I'm going to show you where those have been done, that they're looking at this. This is a suburban community called Columbia, Maryland. It's right outside the beltway around Washington, D.C. Now, I always say every community has the little old lady in tennis shoes who's going to push things, and this pretty well holds true. She does email with all the people in this association of this town. Everybody was okay when it was being mowed, and these are the areas that were accessible, and they would mow them twice a year. Now, in the foreground is one of their nature trails. They have nature trails that crisscross this right-of-way. But when they came when BG&E came in and cut down trees in wetlands and ravines to be compatible with the FERC regulations, FAC 003, well, then everybody went ballistic on them, And so we ended up having community meetings, and this is Elaine, who was the one who spearheaded it, and she was very understanding about what needed to be done. And so on the left-hand side, you see the wetland when it was cut. On the bottom on the left is one of the crews backpack treating, and on the right is how that ended up. We basically are just selectively taking out tall-grown trees and letting everything else come in. Here is a stream crossing, and you're looking at, this is electric and gas on the same right-of-way. This is when it was cut. This is one growing season, and the crew is treating. He's treating a sycamore tree, which is 12 feet tall in 1 year. And this is how that ended up looking after the treatment. He's using thin brick, so on the left you can see the white on the leaves. They had planted along the roadside a Coosa dogwood, which they wanted for aesthetics. So on the right you can see it blooming, and then here's how that roadside looked, where we took out the incompatible trees, treated them, and left the dogwood. Last year we put up educational signs for the public to explain what's being done and why, so that it's more education as people walk those trails. They get a better understanding of how is it that they could go in their house and flip a switch and electricity is there, turn on their stove, and the gas is there. People don't really understand what's involved with getting that energy to them. Unless you have an ice storm and they don't have it, then they understand a little better. But we also, again, we'll do a control site. Here's where we split treated and control. It's an area that had been mowed twice a year, and people said, well, that's grass. And I said, no, it's mostly not grass. It's mostly Japanese honeysuckle, autumn olive, multiflora rose, a lot of different invasives. So you're looking at 2 years here where the autumn olive is coming in where it was not treated. And as we document it, another one that's real bad in the mid-Atlantic area is the Keller Repair which was a landscape plant that was not supposed to escape. But I always say it's like Jurassic Park. Nature will find a way. So it has escaped, and it produces thorns, and it's very bad. It keeps coming back. But you see where the mowing sites, we started this after the '09 mowing, and the mowing sites, the dominance of those invasive plants completely take over. Where on the herbicide site, the only shrub species we ended up with was blackberry, native blackberry, because we didn't target blackberry. We'll give the public a chance to be able to pick blackberries. So that's how it ended up. Again, we put on a workshop. We actually had 50 people from the U.S. EPA come up from Washington to see what IVM is and how herbicides are actually used in our markets. And here, when they needed to do selective treatment, the backpack crews are on the left on the hill, and the people are walking the nature trail. They don't really pay it a mind because they understand what we're doing, and it's not a big issue. For the utility, they needed to replace a section of gas pipeline. They did not have to mow the right-of-way before they did their work. They just came in and the construction crews did their work without having to ask the vegetation department to line up mowing crews first. So we ended up taking on the left, and it ended up looking like you see on the right. One area right along the roadside, this is where they mowed all the time. We had a little bit of milkweed when we started in here, but last year the entire right-of-way was milkweed. So this is what's possible simply by managing. So the pollinators are definitely enjoying the low-growing habitat that's coming back. We had another project where we're doing the bee and bird studies, and this was started about the same time at a request from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And you see all the different groups that were involved. It's about a 6,000-acre tract of land near Annapolis, Maryland, along the South River. Now, when BG&E had cleared the trees again for the FERC regulations, they were on the Baltimore TV station, they were in the newspaper in Annapolis, and the public was like, this is outrageous. We want you to clean up all these logs. I met with Fish and Wildlife, and I said, we don't really want to move these logs. They're going to stabilize the soil and provide habitat for salamanders and snakes, and they agreed. They wanted them there. What Fish and Wildlife did not want is what I call conventional herbicide spraying. And the reason I say that is because IVM is a different concept than just applying herbicides. What you see here is where the contract was leased on a one-year contract, and the contractor had to provide 90% control. They were not told what to use. So what's the cheapest and easiest when you're going through a wet area is rodeo and habitat or emancipate. But what they did, because it's a hilly area, they broadcast sprayed. Well, they did not have to take out things like viburnum shrubs. So Fish and Wildlife was not happy with that. So when we got to where we were doing our documentation, we stopped them from doing that. In the upland areas, we did a controlled application with selective type of chemistry. So we're taking out the trees, but on the right you see herbaceous plants and milkweed coming back. In the wetlands, where we needed to, we worked with them to remove phragmites on the left, which is an invasive reed grass. On the right, it's back in native plants, and that's how that right-of-way ends up looking. But in the ravines and along the border zone, we did not want to damage the shrubs, so instead of broadcasting, we did selective backpack treatment. Take out the trees, leave the shrubs, and they provide the stabilization for these ravine areas, and we didn't get the effects of washout from heavy rains. So you end up combining a prairie type of habitat and a shrub habitat on a right-of-way, but in separate zones. The wire zone is your prairie, the shrubs is the border zone. Fish and Wildlife has been documenting along with Audubon, and they've documented 120 species of birds using the right-of-way now. Some of them, like on the upper left, is the prairie warbler, which is that along with wood thrush are a couple of the species they're very concerned about because of loss of habitat. But then you're also getting food and cover for the pollinators, different plants coming in that you'll see a number of different pollinators, and some of them, flies, hornets, wasps. 40 species of butterfly have been documented. And so during the workshops, I'm in the dark green shirt on the right, and in the white shirt is Rich Mason. He's with the Chesapeake Field Office of U.S. Fish and Wildlife. He was explaining about the birds. But somebody in the audience asked, well, what kind of habitat do we need in the state of Maryland? And so I let Sam Droege, who's with U.S. Geological Survey, answer. And he said, well, everybody thinks we need more forest. We have more forest than we had 100 years ago in Maryland. What we don't have is prairie. And you're standing in probably the best prairie habitat in the mid-Atlantic. Now, this is 2 years after the cutting. So you're seeing a very quick transition. One of the groups that was invited to this workshop was the Maryland Public Utility Commission, or Public Service Commission they call it. And when they saw what was available by using IVM for habitat, that is now a requirement. If the utility wants to build a transmission line in the state of Maryland, they have to get what's called a Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, CPCN. There was a windmill being built in Pennsylvania, the adjoining state, which you see on the left, and the generator lead line coming from those windmills back to the power grid in Maryland, they needed to get the permit, and the Public Service Commission said, okay, you can build it only if you practice IVM. And they said, well, we don't know what you're talking about. We're engineers building windmills. And so they asked them to give me a call, and we see the crews on the right doing the selective treatment. The Patuxent Wildlife Refuge, because of the work with Fish and Wildlife, their own people said, why don't you try to adopt this here? This is a research refuge. Well, Baltimore Gas and Electric has 5.5 miles of right-of-way through here. They used to have to very expensively hand-cut and maybe stump treat. We put together a management plan on this 5.5 miles of line, and we're looking at invasive weed control, controlling the trees, and providing habitat. One of the things we did that on the left, you see their broadcast treating from a tractor. Fish and Wildlife wanted to get rid of Korean Lespedeza, which was used for soil control, erosion control, but it's not a very good plant for wildlife and it's invasive. So we broadcast for that purpose there. On the right, you see a border zone where we were selective. But the Lespedeza control, you see it was basically 80% of the plant community. And you see how it's transitioned to nothing but native grasses and forbs, which you see here. Autumn olive, calorie pear, we're using what's called a hydraulic treatment, which is like a garden hose. And again, you see how that's transitioned. You're going to get some, we're tracking if there's dead vegetation, which of course if you use a dense area and do a herbicide, you're going to have dead vegetation. But it's also important to have some bare soil, because some of these native bees, primarily like the bumblebees, they will nest in either bare soil or dead stems. So you don't want a carpet of grass like you see on a golf course cell. But we're getting, again, milkweed coming back when we control these invasives. Then we did selective backpack treatments where they wanted to keep some shrubs for a wildlife crossing. And again, you see the dead stems that were treated. You see a lot of shrubs coming in. And USGS had put up these cones on the left as artificial nesting sites for the native bees. When they saw those dead canes on the right, they said, don't cut those down. Now, you'll get some utilities, if they do a treatment, they want to come back and mow it down the next year for aesthetic reasons. But the pollinator experts say, don't mow that down. Let those things stand because those are bee homes. And so they've documented 145 species of bees. One bee had never been documented before, didn't even know it exists, and 6 of them were rare that are on the right-of-way. Again, we put on workshops. This is the Mountain Lake Vegetation Management Conference, which is a regional conference in the Mid-Atlantic with different utilities and contractors. Now let's make a visit to the west, because a lot of people think everything's in the east. This is with Arizona Public Service. Started working with them about 8 years ago. First to get the trees removed for the FERC regulations. But then we did after 2009, this right-of-way was mowed. This is near Prescott, Arizona. And we used the fence line of the Forest Service as the dividing line. On the left is the Forest Service, which you see the trees coming back. On the right is where we did selective herbicide spraying. Now last year, the Forest Service side had to be either mowed or hand cut. On the treatment side, this is what it looked like. No maintenance was needed. You see how that plant community continues to be dominated by the grass and forbs. And we can be selective. You'll see trees treated, but the flowering shrub there is cliff rose, which we left for pollinators. The other aspect we need to concern primarily out west is fire breaks. Right-of-ways can serve as fire breaks, but you can't leave the ladder fuels such as juniper and pinyon pines and oaks. So if you manage it, this is the type of cool plant communities you will have that would allow that right-of-way to become a fire break. It also helps working with other groups. This is the Navajo Nation. When they saw IVM, they were very pleased, allowed them to adopt it. And one of the things we did was put together a partnership to control Russian olive and tamarisk or salt cedar in the watersheds. And then we put a workshop on for the Navajo, and the Navajo EPA gave a grant to IVM Partners to help with rangeland restoration and erosion control. So they wanted to control sagebrush to allow the grasses to come back and improve grazing, because their primary economy in the Navajo is cattle and sheep. But it also improves pollinator habitat, such as you see here with Rocky Mountain bee plant and the hummingbirds. Other groups, because they see what's possible, Fish and Wildlife asked us if we would help control invasives. This is calorie pear being treated, either hack and squirt on the left and backpack, on an organic farm, and that was the Navy dairy farm that served the Annapolis Naval Academy. And so we treated that, as you see here. The left is when they're treating it, and on the right. It was paid by a grant from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, which is the largest environmental group in the Chesapeake region. So again, the technology and the expertise, when groups see that what's possible, they'll want to adapt it. This is an old landfill that was a Superfund site that the Wildlife Habitat Council is helping to manage. And we have, this is Weeds Incorporated treating the trees and the invasives and converting it over to native prairie type of meadow, as you see on the right. So basically, IVM can restore pollinator habitat anywhere. Basically just need to establish a management plan and pursue it with the best practices. Now, I co-chaired a task force with the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign, and this is a brochure we have for right-of-ways as being habitat for pollinators. That happens to be the right-of-way from BG&E that's on the main cover. I know from IVM Partners, we have a management agreement with both Wildlife Habitat Council and the Pollinator Partnership to work jointly on a lot of these projects. So, kind of sum up, when you look at the entire North America, and I have U.S. here, I just gave a presentation in Kentucky, but we're really talking about U.S. and Canada. You're looking at all this type of right-of-ways that are available. And so if you take the electric grid on the left, the gas grid on the right, where are we crossing all the different ecosystems that are in North America? And what I'm looking at is trying to establish documentation in all these different ecoregions, kind of mirroring where are the bird migration routes, where are the monarch butterfly migration routes, so that we can show what's the best practices in all those different areas. So we can provide the habitat. There's a lot of push of what's going on with agriculture, with Roundup Ready beans and corn. But everybody has an electric or gas right-of-way coming through or a highway. I know the U.S. Fish and Wildlife is considering listing the monarch butterfly as a threatened and endangered species. That could change a lot as to what people are doing, whether or not that would be a taking. Fish and Wildlife is looking at establishing 1 million acres of pollinator habitat along Interstate 35, which basically goes from Laredo, Texas to Canada. And again, what I'm trying to do is broker some of these agreements between the utilities, the agencies, conservationists, and academia. Get them on board with documenting what their expertise is: pollinators, bees, butterflies, birds, and whether or not we're in the New England states, our tropical habitat we have in Florida, out in California, not just take token areas where we're planting something, but control the invasives like you see in the Pacific Northwest, like Scottsboro. Bring back the native habitat. And so this is basically what I'm trying to do under IVM Partners, and we're looking for utilities and highway departments and others to join the cause, and I think combined we can get a lot of good done. So thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I do have a couple of questions that were written in. I'll go ahead and read those, and then after that, if we still have some time, I can unmute everybody and people can ask questions if they have something that's come up. The first question is that some utilities have utilized videos at a high cost to produce and have not seen good results. Curious to hear of any benefits with educational media videos.
Well, I know I worked with Arizona Public Service. We did a video a year ago. We did a workshop for the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management at that Prescott site where I showed the comparison. And Dovetail Partners, which is part of the accreditation program, they were also on it. I think that that's a pretty good video. I know that there's a link with Arizona Public Service and Dovetail Partners. I could also provide a link to you. But that was a pretty good video. I have a short video on my consulting website, which I had Virginia Tech University make a few years ago. And it is a very concise 13-minute video that talks about why utilities, electric and gas, and highway departments, why they have to manage vegetation, and then why IVM is the best practice. And I could just so your listeners know, that's on www.begmgmt.com. And you can go on there and just click on that video and watch it. So, I don't know, I think that's a pretty effective. I would say let people look at that and see what you think. Other ones, I think it's kind of hard to capture everything that goes on, what's possible on the application techniques in a quick video, but I'm not sure what the people have seen that they're putting that observation out on.
Okay, the next question is, can IVM safely be used in areas with endangered plants?
Endangered plants, yes, and what we have done that, like, I'll give you the first time we did it was with the green pitcher plant. I don't know if it's endangered, but it was threatened. And it was being encroached by Phragmites, which is that marsh grass which would just take over. And I was working with the Nature Conservancy on it. And they didn't want any spraying. They said, no, we don't want any chemicals. And I said, well, you're going to have to keep cutting it, and it's going to completely take over. You're going to lose the pitcher plants. So we went out and we did selective treatment and took out the invasives, took out the trees, and the pitcher plants ended up expanding in their range. We have the techniques, particularly with backpack treatments, the thinvert, where I can take out one plant and not touch one right next to it. We could be very precise. The important or I'll work with whoever they have and train them on how to do it right. But yeah, it is definitely possible.
Okay, next question. What additional impacts have resulted in the change in habitat within your right-of-way? I would imagine once you introduce a new habitat, you may possibly introduce a new environmental impact to your schedule for any work or inspection in following years.
I have definitely seen a change in habitat. I haven't seen it adversely impact inspections or maintenance. I've seen it be positive. You have ready access. You don't have to wait for somebody to cut it to get into the right-of-way, number one. You can change the plant community in different areas of the right-of-way, like I showed, where you might want low-growing grasses for an access route and shrubs in different areas. So I've never seen it be detrimental. We can change it depending on what your management needs are. And that's why I started out saying it's very important to identify what your objectives are, both primary and secondary. What do you have to consider? And then manage to meet those objectives. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all. You do different things on different areas of a right-of-way. But where you have distinct needs, then you adjust your techniques to meet those objectives and the situation that arises. Like I showed, if you're in a ravine, instead of broadcasting from the top of the hill and letting everything drop down with a non-selective herbicide like Roundup, you're going to use herbicides that are more selective in what plant communities they actually affect, and be selective in how you apply them.
Okay, perfect. I am going to actually unmute everybody at this point.
Unmuted.
And if anyone has a question that they would like to ask, feel free to do so. And everybody should be unmuted at this point. Any comments that anyone has?
The snow melts more or less. Soon the willows start to bloom, we'll be out searching. So for that area to be a little bit slower than fall, that maybe 3 weeks.
I didn't catch that. Was that a question?
I don't think so. I think it was background noise. Any questions that anyone has?
Well, I have a question, and this is just to play the devil's advocate. My name is Mary Purcell, and I just wondered, I'm with the USDA, by the way, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and some of these trees that you're cutting down are important pollinator forage material. So I wonder what others that know more about plants that support pollinators might think about this technique that you're recommending.
Well, let me respond first, and then if somebody else has, they can join in. When you're talking about different trees that we might be cutting down, might be pollinator plants, that's true. The issue is though that particular you're on a utility right of way. That right of way is there for the primary purpose of providing safe and reliable delivery of energy to the public. So if you have a transmission line, that utility is going to have to do whatever's necessary to make sure that they don't lose power to the public or have an issue with the pipeline. So in those situations, that particular species of tree, if it's a tall growing tree, is not compatible with the operation of that particular right-of-way. So it may be a good pollinator plant, but it's not a good fit there. It would be the same as having a large diameter tree growing 10 feet from an interstate highway. Yes, it might be a good plant for certain species, but is a definite safety hazard to the public because if they go off the road, somebody's going to get killed running into that tree. So yeah, you have to look at, you're not going to meet the needs of everything out out there, a right-of-way is there for a purpose. And that's why all the time when I'm doing training, people will say, well, I don't want this cut, I don't want that cut. And I said, look, you have to understand, we have to have this right-of-way. You know, by law, they have to keep this thing clear. They have to provide the energy to the public. We can try to meet as many secondary objectives as possible. Something like that, we can't. And I know working like in Patuxent Wildlife Refuge, they used to say, okay, certain oaks they wanted to keep, and when they got 3 meters tall, they could top them. And I say, we're not going to keep topping everything. We're talking about trying to adapt a best practice that's applicable across the continent. And maybe find in a little local place, but that's not something you're going to set up as a best practice. So you have to look at what the needs are and what is the purpose of what you're trying to manage.
This is Flavia Rakowski, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I think the woman's point was well taken, but I will add that we ought to look very specifically at the species of trees that were removed before we say that these trees that are being removed are good pollinator habitat. And Rich, if you could work up a list, a quick list of the species that were mainly removed, I will spend some time looking at those species' utility as pollinator habitat.
Well, I appreciate that, Flavia, but here's what I would put out there, though. I'm working across the country, and, you know, here I'm in Delaware when I'm talking right now.
Yeah, and so am I.
Where you are.
Yeah.
Right. So, but, you know, here, you know, the northern part of Delaware, you're primarily an oak, hickory, maple type of a forest. The southern part of Delmarva is the southern pines, loblolly, Virginia pine, maple, sweet gum. And then when you get out to Arizona, you're talking about gambrel oak and pinon pine and juniper and ponderosa and Douglas fir at the high elevations and, you know, saguaro cactus in the low elevation. It all depends on where you are. And
right, and I agree completely with your response. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just that wherever you are, there are certain species that particular utility would say, we know these are tall-growing species, and they can't coexist in our right-of-way.
Yeah, if we have to take out some oaks, we have to take out some oaks.
Right, right. Exactly. Now, I do know, though, like working with Fish and Wildlife, on the trees that are along the edge of a right-of-way, sometimes some of those will be what we call a danger tree that could fall over and take out the lines. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those would be removed by utility. Well, we'll work as a best practice to say, instead of removing the tree, we'll top it low enough that if it falls over, it will not be able to hit the lines, and then it can stay there as a den tree for wildlife.
Right, and what we might lose in terms of pollinator habitat, we would gain for some other taxon.
Correct. Exactly. Exactly.
We have about 8 more minutes if anybody else had any questions. Now would be a good time to ask.
Hello, this is, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, I'm in Florida. I work with the Department of Agriculture, and I kind of have 2 questions. One is, what is your involvement with State Department of Agriculture? I understand this is not necessarily immediately overlapping, but obviously we saw the different projects in various states that you highlighted, but how would we go about finding out what IVM projects are already in our state and who those contacts are to begin to facilitate or improve or expand the process in our individual states?
Okay. Did you say you were in Florida?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I don't know. I know that I don't have any projects there right now. I'm trying to get something going with Florida Gas Transmission up in the Panhandle, up around Tallahassee, and also talking to the Departments of Transportation for the same purpose. As far as how would you find out, I guess contact the if you're looking at the utilities, you can contact who's ever in your area. I think your biggest one is Florida Power. But as far as a clearinghouse for it, I don't know that we have one yet. I know that what I'm revamping our IVM Partners website right now to put locations so people will know where we have documentation and what that looks like. What are we finding there? What are the plants that are coming back? What are the target plants? But at the moment, I don't have anything active in the state of Florida.
Okay, we're currently, personally, I'm working on pollinator protection for the State Department of Agriculture, and every other state in the country has actually been tasked to do a similar thing. And one of the main facets of these plans is ensuring that there's adequate and diverse pollinator forage. So this project seems to, or could be, really quite nicely aligned with that.
I agree. I know that I've done training here in the state of Maryland for their Department of Agriculture. I've done some in Delaware before. I just spoke at the. Usually, you have a vegetation management association, and I just spoke at Kentucky and Alabama. You also have a big with your water management areas down there in Florida that do a lot of management along the canals. That would be another group to tie in on providing pollinator habitat, where they're managing along all your canals. But I would say to pull together a conference with the stakeholders, and I'd be happy to come and speak at something like that to show some of the practices. But I think that would be your best bet, is to get a hold of the stakeholders in the state and say, what are you doing now, and have you considered this?
Perfect, thank you.
You're welcome.
We probably have time for one more quick question. Does anyone have one question? Okay then. Well, Richard, thank you so much for providing us with this presentation. It was certainly very informative, and we thank you so much.
My pleasure. So, glad to get the word out, and hopefully we'll get some, like the last question about the state of Florida. Hope we'll get some of these areas across the country, and where we're not doing it, let's get started, because we have a great opportunity to take advantage of land that's already being maintained. It's just doing best practices, and we can convert it over to pollinator habitat.
Okay, great. And thank you to all the participants who joined in on the call today and viewed the webinar. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.